This is a makeup lecture for Philosophy 3 Aesthetics on Plato's philosophy of art. I'm not feeling well, so please forgive the voice quality. So we saw last time in Philosophy 3 that Plato's version of the nature of the world is somewhat unintuitive for us. At the top of the universe and the most real thing in the world is God. God has the idea of everything: horse, car, chair, bed, human, mountain. All of these ideas exist in heaven, and they exist whether or not anything physical exists in the world. On the other hand, there are earthly objects, and earthly objects exist for Plato just in case they instantiate, or they are a representation of the eternal form. So a chair is a chair just in case it's made in the image of a chair. Or a buffalo is a buffalo rather than a deer, just in case it follows that idea or that form of the buffalo rather than the form of the deer. So because the ideas for Plato are real, and the ideas describe the characteristics in virtue of which something can even have an identity as an object on earth. For Plato, it's the ideas which are ultimately real. The simple, temporary, passing away, imperfect things on earth can never approximate the idea. And so they are, for Plato, unintuitively less real than the things as they exist in heaven, or the realm of ideas. We should remind ourselves that when we use the word heaven here, we're not using it directly in the sense of, let's say, a Christian heaven. It's a much more formal idea than that, and Plato exists about 600 years before the birth of Christ. So don't confuse the idea of the realm of ideas and God directly with something like we see there. So we've said that orders of reality go like this. There's the real and eternal, and that exists only in heaven, or the realm of the forms, the realm of the ideas. And then there are things on earth, and they exist only because God makes them possible. God, and in some sense for Plato, God sort of contains, or all the rest of the ideas, the eternal ideas, emanate from God or from the one divine source, and from those ideas come the ordinary objects on earth. We talked about mountains and beds and how they exist in virtue of, for the mountains, approximating the form of a mountain. And the basic form of a mountain is something just like a land formation that protrudes beyond something that we consider to be a valley. Or the idea of the bed, which is just a good place for human beings to sleep. In the case of the bed, we said that maybe intuitively it makes a bit more sense for us to say that something is a bed just because the idea behind the bed is for us to sleep in it. Alright, so this is where we left off last time. And if you did the reading, you remember that Plato does quite a bit of talking about the bed and the bed maker and the relationship to the artist. So Plato has his interlocutor in the dialogue here talking about the bed and the bed maker and the artist. And the entire discussion starts with a discussion of imitation. And Socrates is convinced that, and he's reflecting Plato's idea here, that artists are imitators, and for that reason they have little value for the state, and little value for culture, little value for our lives. And so, in the dialogue, Socrates says, well, consider, for example, a bed maker. A bed maker doesn't have the idea of the bed, right? The big idea. That exists in heaven. That's God's idea. But a bed maker can at least make a bed. It's imperfect. It's never going to be as good as the ideal of the bed, right? Any bed that you sleep on, you're going to think, Well, it could be a little bit more comfortable if, but at least the bed that the bed maker makes is useful. We need beds. But Plato says there is some, speaking as Socrates here, there is some great magician excuse me, who makes not only beds, but this magician can make bed makers, he can make gods, and he can make anything that anyone else can make. So at first, we have Socrates' interlocutor being pretty impressed with the idea that there's someone who can make not just one thing, like a bed maker might specialize in, but anything, including the gods. But of course, ultimately, he's not going to be a very impressive creature, because this most talented creature who can make anything at all is the artist. And Socrates brings up the idea that the artist can in some sense make anything at all because, like Homer, the great tragic poet, he can represent people doing anything at all. So he can make beds, he can make civilizations, he can make battles, he can talk about strategies of war and strategies of medicine and strategies of politics. In some sense, seems to be the most powerful and creative person in the world because they can create everything that makes up life and makes up society. But as you know from the reading, ultimately Socrates is going to say that this magician is a fraud and that he is 3 removes from the truth. So why 3 removes from the truth? Well, as we saw, the bed itself that the ordinary bed maker makes is only a poor approximation of the idea of a bed. And then the artist creates an image of that bed. So let's talk about what that looks like. So we know there's the original bed. That's God's idea of the bed. There's also the bed that a craftsman makes. There's the bed as it appears to a viewer. In other words, there's a sense in which when I look at the real bed, I represent to myself only one angle or one aspect of that bed. And then because Plato has in mind here especially someone like a poet or a painter, the painter represents just the bed as it appears to a person. So you end up with 3 removes from the truth, right? The truth is the idea of the bed. The craftsman, the bed maker, tries to make a bed and he makes at least a usable bed. The individual who tries to look and understand that bed gets a representation of that bed from a certain angle, looking in a certain way. And then the artist uses that representation, the way the bed looks to him, to create a representation of the way the bed looks to him. And so Plato's going to say, the artist's representation is the farthest thing from the truth. So obviously the reason that the artist can create anything at all is because he creates these things only as they appear and not as they really are. So the great magician is something of a fraud because his creation is not legitimate. It's a representation only, and sort of an impoverished representation. Plato compares it to someone who might take a mirror and hold a mirror up to something to create an image of what was there. And he points out that he's not very impressed by that because it's sort of not the same thing as creating the world, it's just reflecting it. So the value of art then for Plato is going to be somewhere between little and none. Why? Because sometimes art inspires us to be good, but more often it inspires sympathy for flawed people. So you remember that Plato thinks that our world down here, below heaven, below the realm of ideas, is a pretty messed up place. And anything, whether it's a bed or human action or nature itself, is a poor imitation of the true idea of what everything could be if it wasn't limited by being in this physical form, in this physical world. So Plato wants us to think about the higher things, about God and goodness and virtue and duty and even mathematics, which he sees as ideas that are eternal. He doesn't want us to be looking down here on earth. Looking to heaven and not looking to earth is what Plato wants us to do. But art, in Plato's view, whether it's poetry, painting, tragedy, gets us looking at human beings and the things that humans do, or at nature around us. So it can inspire sympathy for flawed people because, for example, if I watch a really good tragedy, I see bad people doing bad things and getting punished for it. But the tragedy is only going to be a good tragedy if I feel sympathy for the characters who are suffering. So let's say I watch a movie with a gangster who is a bad person who does bad things to bad people. The story will be completely uninteresting unless the story involves a person for whom we understand why he did the evil things he did, and we at least somewhat empathize with that character. We think something like, oh yeah, maybe if I was in that situation, if I had to defend my family's honor, or I had to make enough money for my family, then I would do the things that this evil gangster did. But Plato thinks that's exactly the opposite of how we should be thinking. If we feel sympathy for these flawed characters, then we're more likely to think, okay, well, I guess the separation between good and evil, which is really important for Plato, is not as concrete as we thought. Plato worries that that's going to corrupt us as individuals and also corrupt the state, corrupt our culture. And the second point, which we've already pointed out at length, is that because art is an imitation, no real knowledge is gained from this. We should go right to the true thing, right? So if I want to learn about beds, don't go to an artist who painted a picture of a bed. At least go look at the bed for yourself, or become a bed maker, or even better than that, think about what the idea of the bed is and understand it sort of intellectually. And for Plato, that's the best form of understanding. Plato gives the example of Homer and says that Homer, the great tragic poet, writes about things like governing, heroics, and medicine. But, says Plato, if Homer really knew about all these things, then he would go out there and be a hero. He would have ruled a state, or people would have ruled a state using his principles, and he would have just gone out there and cured people if he really understood medicine. So, is there any such thing as good art for Plato? Well, the best kind of art for Plato is art that holds a mirror to nature, so that at least we can accurately represent the world the way it is. Of course, it's not going to be completely accurately. It's going to be sort of an image, but at least it, let's say in the case of painting, looks like the thing I'm trying to paint. Plato also had at least a little bit of sympathy for art that inspires good action. So rather than, let's say, a tragic film that told about an unsavory character who does bad things that we understand, Plato would rather stories of, let's say, heroes going around and doing the right thing all the time, so that we can learn to at least be inspired by that kind of good action.